If only, sorry, I think we're on. If only the United States would give more stuff to Ukraine, they would probably win the war. If we had delayed, so many people said this earlier this year. If Biden had gotten his big aid package to Ukraine in September, October of last year when he really wanted it, then the whole war would have unfolded differently, and the Ukraine wouldn't have lost Avdiivka and several other places here. At least that's the narrative. But what we're finding out when you actually look at the reality on the ground, a little bit different of a story. And we have back with us today, hadn't been here in a while, we have Mike Dimino, my colleague at Defense Priorities, a fellow at Defense Priorities there, has just returned from a trip to Ukraine where he's got some firsthand information. So not just that, he can figure out some things or he's got this great analysis capability, which he always has, but now we've added to that some firsthand experience. So Mike, first of all, just welcome back to the show.
Thank you, Danny. It's great to be back with you. I love coming on here and diving in deep with you. I appreciate it.
Yeah, and let's just let's dive right in there. In fact, let me put a map up here. So this is a picture of basically the front lines in the war right there. And in that box in the lower left-hand corner is where you were just at the front lines. Here's a closer up map there that can show. And I wonder if you could just tell us a little bit about what was the purpose of you being there and what did you observe?
Yeah, so I was invited by the Ukrainian government to the Black Sea Security Forum in Odessa. And so I attended that last week. And then in addition to that, I was able to go down to Mykolaiv and then to Kherson City, which was that area in pink highlighted on the map there, right along the southern front lines. You can see the Antonovsky Bridge there, which I saw up close in person, and then those Russian positions just on the other side of the river. The Ukrainian government had folks come out to basically participate in this conference, representing all kinds of different views. And then in addition to that, Ukrainian SBU, took a couple of folks down to the front to sort of do our own, ask and answer. I was able to speak with a few different Ukrainian commanders. I was able to speak with 2 drone pilots. I was able to speak with our SBU counterparts that were there. And it was very interesting, Danny, and it was sort of an opportunity to, conduct a little bit of our own, direct research, if you will, on how things are going in the war effort and getting some important questions answered on, on equipment, on manpower, on sustainment, on sort of where things are in the war effort. And it was fascinating to hear a number of Ukrainians sort of run through these very long laundry lists of issues that they were facing, whether it was Russian jamming that we heard a lot about, or manpower issues that, privately many Ukrainians acknowledge they just don't have enough people in the armed services right now to achieve the, maximalist goals that they're still clinging to, that they haven't updated, right? I mean, the, kind of original claim from Zelensky is what they've been sticking with for the last 2.5 years now, which is to reclaim 100% of the occupied territory in Ukraine by military force. And they just don't have the people to do that. And so we did hear a bit about that in private. We also heard about some efforts that I think are commendable on the Ukrainians.
And I'm sorry, before we get off that, you say you heard about some of that in private. What was the nature of some of those conversations?
Yeah, so there was an acknowledgement that, that even though efforts regarding expanding the draft and conscription from 27 to 25, which Zelensky just did, is just not sufficient. In particular, a couple of the drone operators that I spoke to said that they supported that number going down to 21 or even younger, and to try to get as much capable manpower as they could infused into the armed forces. And again, that would help Ukraine in a number of ways, right? I mean, you remember Valery Zaluzhny, one of the last things he did before he was sort of, unceremoniously moved on from the armed forces is him and Zelensky got into quite a bit of a back and forth on the need for 500,000 fresh troops. And I think Ukraine probably needs even more than that if they want to expand their training efforts, have a more robust operational reserve, be able to, rotate troops in and out of the front at a better pace to improve morale and decrease fatigue issues, right? I mean, really what they probably need is closer to 1 million new troops. And again, that's very hard to do when, if you recall, Danny, back at the beginning of the war in 2022, 860,000 Ukrainian men fled the country. So there's also some discussions I had with a few folks on repatriation efforts, and they acknowledged that a lot of this was unpopular, but a lot of them said, hey, if we want to win, this is stuff that the government needs to take more seriously. And I think Zelensky has been very tepid to go further with some of these initiatives, because I think he does understand the political implications domestically, that it would be very unpopular, especially with a lot of Ukrainian youth, even if folks in the Ukrainian military acknowledge privately that that is what's necessary to
and let me ask you, at least of the people that you talked to, how many of them thought, no, really, if we just get some more guys, we can win. We can drive Russia out of here. Vice some that said, yeah, we're just fighting because I have to, but I don't see any chance to victory. Did you talk to anybody in either one of those categories?
Yeah, it was interesting. You kind of run through a laundry list of issues, right? Whether it was Russian jamming or manpower or internal sort of disputes about, well, this commander is better than this commander, and this unit's better than that unit. They would a lot of times they would sort of wrap up that long list of issues with, and we're going to win, right? And I understand the need for optimism and the need for, confidence when you are, in the front and you are, in the middle of it. I certainly understand that. But at the end of the day, we can't be placating that false hope in the West just because we don't want to, offend anybody's sensibilities. So there was this notion of, hey, here's the 85 issues that we have that are really serious. And by the way, it's all going to be okay. And there was not really a lot of connective tissue to explain, well, how are you going to solve those problems? And again, many of those issues had very little to do with U.S. aid. There were, the regular chorus of people that said, if we could only get, this or that or the other thing. But many of the issues, like the manpower issues, have absolutely nothing to do with, how many ATACMs or Abrams or Bradleys we send to Ukraine.
And did you have any conversation with any senior Ukrainian officials that may have been talking about what their policy is, and whether privately or otherwise, about what they actually thought was possible?
Yeah, I think the more senior folks that I was able to speak to, I think understood that they were more in the public spotlight, as elected officials or other people. And I think their comments were a little bit less candid, frankly, and a little bit more PR sort of focus grouped. So no, there was not a lot of willingness to have sort of a serious aside with some of the very senior folks. But I think the people closer to the actual fighting were comfortable, kind of taking me aside and saying, "Hey, Mike, we don't have enough guys, and we don't, and X and Y, right?" So that was interesting too, and I think it's not too dissimilar from what we might see in our own military, right? Disconnect kind of between the more senior brass and the guys actually doing the work a lot of times. So
yeah, I've seen a lot of that.
Right, I know you have, and so I noted that as well. I think by and large, a lot of them really do want to continue the war. I think that was interesting to see in person. I've kind of gone back and forth on, well, how motivated are they, and how genuine is that motivation, and do they feel like the West is sort of dragging them through this or not? I did get the sense, to be honest with you, that many of these Ukrainians really believed in what they were doing, believed in trying to defend their country. And I certainly understand that. Again, though, this gets to kind of the broader issue that we're here to discuss today on this no silver bullet idea that, even if we want to help Ukraine, and even if Ukraine is doing their best to defend themselves, these maximalist goals of reclaiming 100% of their territory by military force on their own, right, without getting NATO or somebody else directly involved in the fighting with them, it's just not feasible. There's just no pathway to that. And in my latest paper, we kind of crunch the numbers on that and do a full breakdown. I think one of the deeper breakdowns that anybody's done to actually examine a lot of the claims and a lot of the data on aid and what is preventing it from making the difference. And again, these structural issues facing Ukraine have to be corrected in other ways. And I would argue some of them Yeah, I don't know how you correct them. I don't know if they
Yeah,
are correctable,
right.
right? This idea that
Let's jump into that. And
sure.
just for our viewers, understand, I've already got the link to this paper in the comments or the description section, so you can look at this at your leisure as you want to. But here is the headline here. This is a Defense Priorities publication here, and there's several things that you've put in here. And I want to talk first of all about point number one, which is that you're addressing the thing that says delayed or insufficient aid is often blamed for the failure to succeed, but you're saying the truth is more complicated. What do you mean by that?
Yeah, so I think there's been this tendency over the last 3 years, whenever Ukraine falters in any way, right? Whether it's the summer counteroffensive from last year, or it's the issues that we saw in Kharkiv in the north briefly in May, there's this reflexive response by many of the most ardent sort of Ukraine supporters and many in the West to say, well, it's only because we didn't give them F-16s, or it's only because they didn't have this weapon system, or it's only because we didn't give them enough Bradleys or something, right? I mean, every single time, rather than really looking at what went wrong and trying to do some serious, objective military analysis about it and call balls and strikes and hold people accountable and really ask tough questions, there's this attitude of, well, it's just that we didn't help Ukraine enough. And it kind of reminds me, Danny, frankly, of that old joke about communism, right? Communism can't fail. It can only be failed, right? And this is sort of what we've seen with Ukraine. Ukraine can't fail. Ukraine can't do anything wrong. It can only sort of, be failed by the West in as far as not providing, enough of any, pick your weapon system. And so the paper goes through a lot of that and discusses, the underlying issues, the structural issues that everybody glosses over when they just sort of make it about, well, we didn't give enough. This package wasn't big enough. That package wasn't big enough. You're not really having a real discussion about what's going on the front and what's going on the ground when you're just sort of trying to score political points about, the sizes of certain aid packages and things like that.
Yeah, and I want to play. There's a lot of videos I could play from the U.S. side that, and the administration was keen on it. Saying that the fact that we didn't get this aid package passed back in September, October of last year was responsible for lots of failures on the battlefield. There's one leader though who is saying in some pretty detailed ways that was not the case. And here's Viktor Orban of Hungary. It's a little bit of a long clip, but it's important because it really gets to your point here.
On the war issue, you should know that that Hungary has a very unique situation in this whole war because Ukraine is not a country far away. Ukraine is our neighbor. Second, we have minorities, ethnic minorities living in Ukraine, 200,000 something, and they are part of the war. They are conscripted as soldiers to the Ukrainian army, and they die. So we lose lives daily, Hungarian lives as well. So therefore, we consider this whole situation from a special angle. So we do not belong to the mainstream European approach. And my position was, or the position of Hungary was, the very first moment that this war is the failure of diplomacy. It should have never happened, that war, outbreak. So looking what's going on the front line, for us, it's obvious that the battlefield solution does not work. So whoever right and whoever not, you rightly describe the situation that Russia invaded Ukraine, but the question is not who invaded whom, the question is what will be the next morning. The next morning, the fact is that more and more people will die, and there is no chance to have a victory on neither side.
But do you really think there is no chance of Ukraine winning?
That's
and
my
surely
point.
They stand very little chance of winning without the aid which you are currently blocking.
No, my position is that looking at the reality, looking at the figures, looking at the surroundings, looking at the fact that NATO is not ready to send troops, it's obvious that there is no victory for poor Ukrainians on the battlefield.
So he expressly contradicted the narrative that, well, it's in this case it was some European aid that he was holding back at the time, as opposed to the aid that the U.S. Delayed their getting passed. But he said it's not a matter of the aid; it's a matter of basically the personnel. There's not the fundamentals there to win, and so he said we need to find a negotiated settlement, because unless America or NATO sends troops on the ground to fight conventionally, and that's a whole separate issue we could talk about separately. But he said without that, it's not going to matter with the aid, and that's why we need to have a negotiated settlement. So when you write that the aid wouldn't have made a difference, how do you argue that? For example, if the aid had been passed, let's say in October of last year, what difference would that have made or not made on the battlefield from where we are right now?
Well, I think there's two things to sort of point out here, Danny. I think the first thing to point out is, let's not forget the chorus of people that argued that Ukraine was sufficiently furnished with aid and equipment and arms at various points in the conflict to achieve things that they just didn't achieve. And one example of this that I note in the paper, Ben Hodges said before the summer counteroffensive that Ukraine could cut the land bridge to Crimea in a matter of months as composed, right? Without F-16s or additional equipment, that all the, billions of dollars we had already given them was more than enough to do that. And of course, he couldn't have been more wrong. The summer counteroffensive, failed to achieve any kind of significant tactical or strategic objectives. And Ukraine lost 20% of all of the combat equipment that it committed to that fight within the first 2 weeks of the counteroffensive, right? So there's bigger issues going on here. And that's what I talk about in the paper is, we talk about Russian tactics all the time. We never talk about Ukrainian tactics. We never talk about Ukrainians failing to dig in artillery pieces. We never talk about General Syrskyi, the commander-in-chief of the Ukrainian armed forces, assuming command at the brigade level in Kharkiv and in other places, which is totally contrary to any kind of Western or NATO doctrine. It's totally backwards, vestigial kind of Soviet way of doing things. We don't talk about the fact that, Russia has made innovations on the battlefield, and it's not about giving credit to Russia. It's about acknowledging the facts. A couple of the Ukrainian soldiers that I talked to last week mentioned, earlier in the war, it would take Russia, maybe a week or maybe a couple of days to, do sort of the go through the targeting cycle and identify new positions that we had and go after them. Now he's saying it takes them a matter of hours.
Oh, wow.
Right. So Russia has improved on the battlefield. And it's not this, partisan gamesmanship here. It's about, we need to be honest and just call balls and strikes and analyze the conflict. So Russia has innovated, they've improved their GPS denial capabilities as well. That has blunted the effectiveness of a lot of Western equipment. I mean, you have, M982 artillery shells that were around 70% accurate prior to GPS jamming. Now they're down to 6 or 7% accurate. You have, storm shadows.
I'm sorry. Say that again. Say that. What's inaccurate?
Yeah. So we run through in the paper a lot of the GPS guided artillery shells that we've given to Ukraine, right? Specifically the Excalibur rounds have been rendered dramatically less accurate to the point that they're not even really useful anymore due to this GPS jamming, which of course prevents GPS enabled equipment from functioning, to its full potential. Sometimes you can get around jamming and, it doesn't entirely render the weapon obsolete, but in other cases it does. And you can't target things based on GPS coordinates or using GPS to help guide or weaponeer.
Now, I wonder if you can address another issue that I think is related, that I've seen some information in the open source media, that the guidance system for the HIMARS and the ATACMS, which apparently is very similar, is also subject to Russian EW. What do you know about that?
Yeah, we cover this in sort of the diminishing returns on Western weapons section in the paper, where we talk about all this. GPS denial, right, affects any of these GPS-enabled systems. The HIMARS and ATACMS, of course, are GPS guided. They have, INS and things as well, but they are GPS guided. And then, even things like the Abrams, the Ukrainians for a while sidelined their Abrams tanks, the 31 of them that we've given them, because they lost 8 of them fairly rapidly due to Russian FPV drones, right? So it's not just jamming; it's just it's the nature of this modern battlefield, right? The loitering munitions, the sort of ability to leverage, a variety of things against targets, way beyond the front lines. I mean, so all of this is contributing to an environment where it's very hard to see how Ukraine can get the advantage in manpower and artillery fires necessary to try to take back territory, assuming that is still the goal. And of course, according to Zelensky and everybody else, that's the goal. But again, if you get into artillery production, that's another thing we talk about, right? The United States is on track for about 432,000 155 shells a year as far as production. We're not even there yet, but by the end of 24, we should be hitting that number. And by the end of 24, the Europeans all together, right, all of Europe, they're producing about 1.4 million. And if you add those together, that doesn't get you anywhere near what Ukrainian Minister of Defense Alexei Reznikov said they really need to be effective and go on offense, which he put that number at about 4.5 million shells. And he said that last year. And a lot of people have said, well, that number is too high. And he got a little ahead of himself. He's actually totally right. And he was kind of prescient in throwing that number out there because Russian production on similar, 152 shells is already over 3 million a year, and it's close to 4 million. So the Ukrainians would need to, at the very least, keep pace with Russia as far as, main artillery, tube artillery shell production. And
of course, that doesn't even count that what apparently they're getting from North Korea on top of what they're producing domestically.
Right. And depending on how you're reading some of these stories, that China, which is the most productive economy in the entire world, is providing lethal aid to Russia. And there's been, different sort of reports on that. It's unclear the extent to which that's happening. But let's say China did play a bigger role. I mean, that would be huge. So I think that's kind of the point that I would come back to is if all of Europe and all of the United States didn't save a single artillery shell for their own militaries and sent them all to Ukraine, they would be meeting barely half of what Reznikov said Ukraine needs, and really barely half of what Russia is on track to be producing probably by the middle of 2025. So you can't win a war when, again, these basic 101 kind of things are not being met. So we discussed all that in the paper too. So the limits of Western capacity are also part of why aid is not making a difference. It just, it's funny. People have totally ignored the fact that we don't make anything anymore in the United States. And that does extend to our defense industrial base too. Even Lockheed and Raytheon and stuff, they're not used to high volume production, right? They can pour a lot into these, multi-trillion-dollar programs that are very sophisticated, but we've totally lost track of the nuts and bolts, right? I mean, as of, I think, a year ago, we had 2 factories in the entire United States of America producing 155 millimeter artillery shells. I mean, so there's this reality too that regardless of how you feel about whether or not we should support Ukraine or should continue to send aid, the fact is right now, the U.S. defense industrial base is not able to produce what Ukraine needs on a timeline that really makes sense, right? You can't really go to the Ukrainians and say, well, we'll have the artillery production solved in 2.5, 3 years. I mean, right? They don't have time to wait for that. So
3 years. And of course, that just underscores also the issue of if we should ever find ourselves in an unexpected war somewhere that turns into a sustained conflict, we're going to have a world of hurt trying to get that. But one of the other things that you talked about in this paper, I really want to highlight here because I think it's important, is your point number 4, was that you said neither Washington nor Kiev has articulated a clear theory of victory for Ukraine. Western aid was always a stopgap to buy Ukraine time, not a regime change project to bring about the dissolution of the Russian state. And I want to show a few clips here to really highlight when you say that we don't have a clear vision for what we're trying to accomplish. That is very graphically true. And first of all, I want to show you, this is something from National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan back in, I believe it was February, saying what he said is our objective.
Of course, Ukraine can win. Of course, Ukraine has already succeeded militarily in one of the most profound objectives it had, which was to keep the country from falling into Russian hands. It has already done that, and Ukraine can go further in retaking territory that Russia has occupied.
Yeah, they just need more stuff, he said. So it's to win. Now, I don't know if you saw, but John Kirby on D-Day from France, he was interviewed there, and he was asked by Fox News what the objective was, and he cited Zelensky's, which you said a second ago, is to reclaim to the 1991 borders. And she said, wait. Is that, you're saying President Biden supports going to the 1991 borders? And he said, yeah, of course. But then you have Jake Sullivan again, now subsequent to that, saying this is our objective.
President Zelensky has made clear, including here in Switzerland, that ultimately this war will have to be determined at the negotiating table. The United States' goal has been to put Ukraine in as strong as possible a position on the battlefield, so it is in as strong a position as possible at the negotiating table. It's up to Ukraine to decide when and how that occurs. Its strength at the negotiating table will be improved by what's happened here in Switzerland, because you have more than 100 countries and international organizations coming together to lay a foundation for a just peace built on a simple proposition. You cannot take territory by force. It says that in the United Nations Charter. It's at the core of international law. Ukraine's sovereignty and territorial integrity has to be respected.
And then, I'm sorry, I got one more for you. You have to endure one more, is the Secretary of State Blinken saying that, yeah, forget about all that, but whatever we're doing, it's working great.
The bottom line is this. The Ukraine strategy that we've had and that we've been acting on individually and collectively now for nearly 2.5 years is showing effective results in making sure that Ukraine can ward off Russian aggression, and it's done that remarkably. Keep in mind, Putin's objective from day one was to erase Ukraine from the map, to end its existence as an independent country, to subsume it into Russia. That has failed.
Has it failed, Mike?
Man, I mean, where do you begin with these clips? Especially, Jake Sullivan or President Sullivan, as I call him, because, let's be honest, he's calling the shots on a lot of this stuff, whether anybody likes it or not. Where do you begin? I mean, right. So at first it's, misunderstanding the difference between, Ukrainian, initial success in mounting a defense of the country, and then what's required to do that, which is far less difficult than to go on the offensive and take and hold territory. You need, by a lot of estimates, by a lot of different analysts will tell you at minimum a 3-to-1 advantage in manpower. You need maybe a 5-to-1 minimum advantage in artillery fires to go ahead and do that, right? So reclaiming territory and mounting that initial successful defense of the country, which was successful, just required fundamentally different inputs, right? And that's part of the issue there, is winning on sort of Zelensky's definition takes a totally different toolkit than what Jake Sullivan is talking about. And I do think it's funny that, he seemed to sort of ping pong between both extremes there, kind of saying, well, of course, Ukraine's going to win. And then we'll hold on, really, this is about putting them in a good position to negotiate, because I think even Jake Sullivan is not impervious to the reality on the ground, which would lean far towards the latter rather than the former there, as far as what the United States should be doing and what Ukraine's capabilities are right now. Again, regardless of how anybody feels about it, what they're capable of doing, they don't have that capacity to generate the combat power needed to go on offense. And we could dump a million ATACMS in their laps. If they don't have the people to use them, and the launchers to fire them, and the tactics and the target selection to go after the right targets and conduct all this in a combined arms, maneuver warfare sort of schema that they failed to do in 2023 and showed they did not have the capacity to do, this is the issue. And that's why aid alone can't win the war. And I think it's so dishonest, frankly, that so many of these pundits have said the opposite, right? That it's only about aid, and we actually can't discuss Ukraine's tactics or their military decision-making or their leadership or manpower or Russia's own improvement on the battlefield. We can't talk about any of that. We only have to talk about aid. And I think that hopefully this paper will sort of put that argument to rest.
Now, okay, so in light of all that, in light of all the things you've said and all the things on the full equation, all the things on the Russia side, all the things on the Ukraine side, all the things on the Allied side that they want to provide or whatever. Now then, we're here now less than 2 weeks away from the 75th anniversary of NATO, the big summit in Washington, D.C., to where we're going to be putting something called a bridge to NATO and to NATO enlargement in Ukraine. So tell me as best you can what the correlation between all the reality on the ground you just talked about and this.
We're also here at NATO to talk about the summit that's upcoming in the summer in Washington, celebrating the 75th anniversary of the alliance. Ukraine will become a member of NATO. Our purpose at the summit is to help build a bridge to that membership and to create a clear pathway for Ukraine moving forward. We've done a lot of work on that over the last couple of days here in Brussels, a lot more work to be done between now and the summit, but we will see, I think, in the summit, very strong support for Ukraine going forward in its relationship with NATO.
How do you have a clear path, a clear bridge from where you are now to get Ukraine into NATO when two of the absolute central requirements in NATO documents themselves that say nobody can come into NATO unless, number one, they have all internal disputes resolved. There's that thing going on in the East you may have heard about. And all border issues resolved. And they have this active war where a fifth of their country is occupied by a foreign power. So on that alone, there is no rational path to even say we're going to talk about, Ukraine into NATO. And yet that's what we're celebrating here. How do those two things go together?
Yeah, I think it's really good that you pointed out sort of those two components, Danny. I mean, for decades, those rules have been, strongly enforced when it comes to NATO membership. And that's why, maybe my take on this is a little different from others. I actually don't think, frankly, as totally nuts the Biden administration has been when it comes to this issue, I don't think they really are interested in getting Ukraine into NATO. And I think that part of the evidence for that, I think, is that no membership action plan, no map is going to be presented at the conference. And I think what they're doing with this bridge is to sort of kick the can far enough down the road to obfuscate and sort of, say the right things publicly to support Ukraine because they have to do that. And that's like the most important thing ever. And then, slowly kind of maybe put a little bit of distance there because I'm not convinced that they actually want to go through with all of the agita, all of the stress, all the drama that's going to come with trying to do that. And I hope I'm right. I could be wrong about that, but I feel like, if the Biden administration wanted to, they could have gone through with kind of twisting the arms to get a membership action plan, put forward, get in front of everybody, get it to a point where NATO is sort of, it's sort of a done deal. I think the administration is playing footsie with this on purpose because I think they're trying to, maybe they're starting to see the light on the fact that it's just not going to happen. And again, I'm curious for your thoughts on that. I don't know. I think that the summit is really going to be, like most things when it comes to the Biden administration, performative, virtue signaling, saying a lot of the right stuff, but no actual meat on the bone, no actual details on what they're going to do regarding the actual path here for NATO entry.
Yeah, I had Alex Christopherow on the show earlier this afternoon. We were talking a lot about this, that there is starting to be a bit of a fissure opening up with recent statements by Trump, what he would do if he wins. Nigel Farage in the UK, Viktor Orban, we showed you part of that a second ago, where they're all saying basically the same thing you are, which they say they recognize the ground truth realities here. Ukraine's not going to win. They're not going to. We need to have a negotiated settlement. And then we still have this other thing here. So what I think is happening with this NATO thing is that because the administration has invested itself completely in this course of action from the beginning, even from before the war started and all the way through, that now then I think heading into November 5th, that they don't think that they can change course without taking political hit, or at least the perception of it is. And so I think that they just want to just have happy talk here, especially on the 75th anniversary of NATO at
Right.
Washington. It's a big deal. They don't want it to be sour by saying, yeah, everything we've done the last 2.5 years has been a disaster. So we're going to now forget about all the victory talk and we're just going to have a negotiated settlement, which is what they should do, I think. And we're going to get to that because that's kind of your fifth point here in a second. But I think that that's the reason why, that they just want to just get past this and be happy for a little while, and then maybe do something different, or maybe even just get past November 5th and then they'll do something different. I'm not sure, but I think that they've trapped themselves into this position where they feel like they can't say what needs to happen.
I agree 100%. I think that's actually really well put. And that's why, like, I know a lot of people are getting really focused on the NATO summit. I actually agree with you. I think it's going to be an opportunity to talk nice and do some smoke and mirrors when really all they're trying to do is kick this can down the road. And I think the election has a lot to do with it.
And that does tail into here to the last point I want to bring up here, which is from your fifth one, which I think maybe the most significant in here, is that you say, instead of continuing to placate maximalist fantasies of total victory, the U.S. should advocate for a shift to a defensive strategy and openness to a negotiated settlement that ends the war, such that a sovereign and independent Ukraine state can be preserved in the face of fighting to collapse. I wonder if you could go into some explanation on what that would look like and what a defensive strategy means, is shifting to that, and then a negotiated. How do those things work together?
Yeah, sure. So look, I think it has to start with the main takeaway, which is that, it should be clear to everybody now that Ukraine is not able to reclaim all of its occupied territory with military force, right, on its own. And because of that, right, and because it doesn't have the manpower it needs, it doesn't have the advantage in fires it needs. Russia's getting better. Ukraine's tactics and target selection, in my opinion, have remained poor. Aid is not going to fix the problem. And so now you're kind of left with the realization that, okay, so if Washington's, you can't call it a theory of victory because there is no marriage of ends and means here. But if Washington's perspective was, well, aid can win the war, and we're now realizing that it can't, and a lot of the data that I believe I've marshaled here and other folks have done good work on too, sort of proves that aid alone cannot win the war, then you have to ask, well, so if that was the whole case, theory of the case, now what do we do? And I think one of the things I point out in the paper that I completely acknowledge is that trying to shift to a defensive strategy now is going to be very, very difficult to execute. And the time to do that was much earlier in the war. And now you have a situation where Vladimir Putin may be smelling blood in the water, and Russia has made a number of small to moderate gains in the last several months. They've shown that they've sort of committed to increasing their wartime economy outputs. They're recruiting about 30,000 new troops a month, Danny. So Russia is showing that, they're probably not going to be interested in negotiating right now. And I totally acknowledge that. And this hope that,
by the way, when you were over there, did you hear, I heard a report 3 days ago that I don't know how valid it is. It says that the Ukraine side, in contrast, is being able to recruit about 5,000 per month. Is that close to what you know?
Yeah. And the bigger issue is they lowered the draft age, right, from 27 to 25. And they launched this repatriation program to bring back some of the 860,000 military-age men that left the country in 22. And the Ukrainian government's own analysis found that the sum total of that effort will add 50,000 troops to the military. I mean, that's nothing, right, for the kind of steps they're taking, which is why I point out in the paper, and others have pointed out, if this is really an existential struggle and Ukraine really wants to win, then they need to have a draft for everybody over 18, and they need to conduct forced repatriation of all these people that left the country in the middle of this existential war. So they don't have the numbers, right? And the 5,000 a month, I don't even know if it's that high, to be honest with you.
Oh, wow.
I mean, we saw military recruiters walk in the streets. In Odessa, they were pretty aggressive, searching people, at various checkpoints and stuff, because they have a huge issue with deserters in Odessa and people trying to get out of the country. So we saw all that firsthand. And look, it
Wow.
just underscores that, Russia has a 5-to-1 latent manpower advantage over Ukraine. That's not going to change. If you look at the actuarial tables, if you look at the population maps, right, Russia, attritional warfare actually favors Russia, not Ukraine. And the fact that people have said the opposite over the past 3 years is amazing to me, because it's just not accurate. But the point I come back to is this, Danny, is if aid is not going to win the war, and nobody has any other theory of victory other than just dumping more PDAs into Ukraine, then we have to look at a negotiated settlement, because every modern war has ended that way, right? It's not, it's not ancient Greece. We're not one side is not going to annihilate the other. I think that even goes for Russia, given that sort of the nature of the war right now favors the defender. Yeah, I mean, you can look at the map here. This is male population comparative between Russia and Ukraine. I mean, it speaks for itself. I don't even really need to say anything here. You cannot win a war of attrition if you're Ukraine, if this is, the state of your male population. And so,
looking at that graphic is just so overwhelming. I'd never seen it put like that before this paper. It's really, really stark.
Yeah, I think it is. And I think it should underscore to people that, as we note in the footnote there, the actual disparity could be even worse, given all of the research we've done on, deserters and folks that fled the country and everything else. So, again, that should just underscore the point here that, there is no path to what Zelensky, right, to these pre-war borders. And it's not about putting Ukraine down or being negative. It's about just looking at the facts and being honest about the analysis. And so that's where I think, to kind of wrap up my point, basically the choice is going to be, does Ukraine want to fight to exhaustion and risk collapsing, in which case we could have a scenario where Russia ends up completely taking over Ukraine, or at least taking over Ukraine, maybe half the country or so, as opposed to the 18 or 20% or so that it has now. And then, on the other side, do they want to enjoy all of the Western capital and security assistance that they've been getting, but find a way to negotiate? And even if they lose territory, and even if they end up as a rump state, they're still a sovereign and independent country that is going to have the West take care of all of their, rebuilding, and they're going to. European finance is going to pay for, a whole new city's worth of infrastructure and everything in Ukraine. I mean, they've already talked to some people about some of these post-conflict plans, and people are investing and everything like that. So I don't think that's actually such a bad outcome for Ukraine. That's what I really think the choice is. Keep fighting to a point potentially where there is a collapse, there is a break in the lines, Russia makes some kind of major advance that threatens Kyiv again, or at least, cuts off most of the Ukrainian military. Or do we have a situation where, yes, territory is ceded, but the overall prospects for Ukraine going forward for the next 50, 100 years are actually much better than they would be otherwise? So I think that's kind of the choice, whether anybody likes it or not. Again, I'm not, endorsing one thing or the other. I'm just saying, prognosticating that that's probably the choice here. And I think it's incumbent on Washington to, guide Ukraine towards this diplomatic theory of victory over the long term, rather than trying to, participate in this delusional thinking that, if we just send them one more weapon, or we send them this, fourth gen aircraft, and we also send them this other one, that somehow they're going to take back all of that territory is just delusional. And I think it's actually bad for Ukraine. And so that would be my argument.
So let me put you in a maybe a little bit of an uncomfortable position,
Sure.
but it's incredibly relevant, and it can't be avoided if any prospect at all for your plans, which I fully endorse, to be followed. And that is, how can, even just in theoretical terms, as best you understand, the Biden administration, where it's been since before the war started and all the way through this very day, shift to that in an election year, and somehow not have something negative, not lose the election because of it. I don't know if they can be won, but how would you project that or suggest to the administration that here's how you can put even a good face on it or something, but have a chance to do it so that they could actually put it into effect instead of the happy stuff that it seems we're doing right now?
Yeah, well, I don't think history is going to look kindly on the Biden administration, Danny, because the one big caveat to that plan that I point out in the paper is that it could be too late to do this because the Biden administration was so stubborn in how they approached the war from the beginning and before the conflict that it could be too late. And Putin at this point feels like he has the upper hand. Why would he negotiate? And that really is on Biden. That really is on the Biden administration. If Ukraine ends up collapsing under the weight of this convoluted sort of approach that they've taken because they've been too afraid to do the right thing or say the tough thing to a friend or a partner or an ally and try to, do the right thing, then there's no way around that. So I actually don't think there really is a way for the Biden administration to make this kind of pivot before an election and either not lose the election or have enough people on their side get on board with it quickly enough to make a difference. And that's why I've said many times before, I think the war is going to be resolved one way or another after the election, whether you have a new president in President Trump that I think has been very clear that he wants to end the war and that really the sort of core, America first principle here is really to end the conflict. And that's what I think he'll probably try to do. But even if Biden wins, there could be an opening depending on personnel decisions or other things that happen. I don't know. Maybe he passes away. Maybe in a second term. Maybe there's a new vice president. Maybe it's Gavin Newsom, somebody else, and they have a totally different approach to this. I don't know, but I think it would be very difficult for the Biden administration to make this kind of pivot, and that's why I think one way or the other, whether it's a new Republican president or a new Democratic president, I think unfortunately nothing's really going to change here until after we have somebody new in office.
Yeah, and in fact, this is what President or now candidate Trump again said he would do if he does get elected.
I think Zelensky is maybe the greatest salesman of any politician that's ever lived. Every time he comes to our country, he walks away with $60 billion. I will have that settled prior to taking the White House as president-elect.
Not sure how he would have that taken care of before he would assume his office as a president, but that's definitely where it's going, which of course is probably one of the reasons why the Biden administration wouldn't shift gears, because it sounds like that they're wanting to do what Trump is suggesting, which is anathema to anybody trying to win an election. But here's the thing, Mike. You touched on this just a second ago. It's not inconceivable that there could be a collapse somewhere of the Ukrainian army even before the election. He may not get there. So instead of taking control of this narrative and changing the narrative and trying, and I agree completely with you that it may already be too late to try to do this, but at least you're in control of events, as opposed to just continuing to the fiction that this is going to all work out okay, and then all of a sudden the thing just explodes in your face. And man, if you talk about a losing election strategy, that would be it.
No, I think that's perfectly said, Danny. And I really think that's what they're doing. And that's why I said I don't think history is going to look kindly on them. The Biden administration is closing their eyes right now and just hoping that nothing really changes too much between now and November. And we could have a situation where, maybe a couple months after the election, before even Trump is technically inaugurated, if he wins, that there's some kind of collapse and it's too, U.S. foreign policy is kind of paralyzed in between administrations, and we can't really get stuff done, or we can't get stuff through Congress because they want to wait for a new president. I mean, these are all the risks that you just laid out of this passive approach, which is why I would argue, global security and world peace is a much more important legacy than winning or losing an election. And it would be nice if we had a president that said, look, the greater interest here, the greater good here is trying to end this war, trying to put Ukraine in a good spot to negotiate, and trying to force those talks to happen, even if Ukraine isn't super jazzed about it, because that's really the objective here, even if it did cost him the election or something like that. But again, I agree with you. I don't see that happening. And I think that there is going to have to be a very ugly postmortem here on, did we really missed the chance to negotiate in the first place, which, depending on, who you talk to and depending on sort of different analyses of things that happened all the way back in April of 22 and at other points in the war, there were opportunities there, I think, to push harder for a negotiated settlement. And I think the Biden administration was clinging to this fantasy, like I mentioned earlier, that, well, if we can bleed Russia, maybe let's hold off because that's worth it. And of course, as I outlined in the paper, we've got 70 footnotes in there from top tier sources. I'd love to see anybody try to argue with it. They're recruiting 30,000 people a month. The Russian military is 15% larger now than it was before the war. That's according to our own EUCOM commander. 60% increase in Russian war-related economic outputs now compared to fall of 2022. I mean, like, Danny, this argument that we've bled Russia, or we've sort of succeeded in bludgeoning Russia or causing instability in Russia is just not borne out by the facts.
Yeah, it certainly isn't. And, and more people are finally starting to say some of this. Maybe there's a few cracks in the facade. A lot of people have heard what Nigel Farage said a couple of days ago in Britain. In case anybody missed it, here it is.
I got up over 10 years ago and said that I felt the eastward expansion of NATO and the European Union would be used by a dangerous dictator as a reason to go to war in Ukraine. I said, don't poke the Russian bear with a stick, because if you do, you'll get a very predictable result.
And we actually did have that. I showed that clip earlier. I won't play it now just because it's too long, where he said it 10 years ago. So he really did. And he has been saying this. So a lot of people have been saying that our actions are going to have predictable consequences. Even if you hate Vladimir Putin, you don't have to. This is not any kind of a pro-Putin anything. This is like saying this is human nature. And if you poke a guy who's got some power, he's going to eventually poke back. And so I think that's kind of where we are now. And so much of this stuff is predictable. And I hope that a lot of your stuff doesn't come to fruition as you suggested it may. But we're going to have to wait and see on that. Before I let you go, though, I wonder if you can give us your best understanding and analysis of what you think happened with this missile, this apparently an American ATACMS in Sevastopol on the beach over the weekend that many in Russia have said was intentional. It was an American missile, and there will be consequences. So I wonder if you could talk two things. Number one, what do you think actually happened there? And number two, maybe more importantly, what do you think Russia is going to do as a response?
Yeah, so I think there was a lot unclear about what happened here. If there was some sort of air defense intercept that then led to the missile fragments impacting, or what the actual target was, I think it's really hard to say, if I'm being honest with you. And I haven't done a deep dive on this specifically in the OSINT and taken a look at all this yet. Just coming back from Ukraine and working on some writing, I did see this occur, but I haven't taken a close look at it. So I am planning to do that, and hopefully on Twitter, maybe do a thread on it and kind of give my analysis. I don't think it's entirely clear what happened yet, but I do think the overall concern that people have voiced on escalation and on, how Russia is perceiving this as an intentional attack, as something that maybe the U.S. or others participated in targeting or something like that. Yeah, I mean, that's where it matters. Yeah, you can see Peskov's comments here, right? I mean, that's where it matters from an escalation perspective, and that's often why we say, and when we talk about what's going on in the Middle East or in other conflicts around the world, perception is reality, right? If the Russians are viewing this a certain way, they're going to respond in a certain manner, and really the facts or what happened actually ends up being kind of irrelevant. But either way, I think it is concerning anytime you have attacks on civilians, anytime there's even incidental or collateral damage on civilians. It's unacceptable, and I think that again, this speaks to the targeting issues that I outlined in the paper as well. Even something less dramatic than this, Ukraine has been attacking oil refineries, for example. You had Secretary Austin come out himself and say Ukraine should be focused on targets of operational and tactical value. to the actual front that will allow them to conduct better active defense or claim territory. Attacking Sevastopol certainly has nothing to do with that, if that was indeed what happened. So that's again where I would say, if it was intentional, it's not a good target. And if it were some sort of air defense intercept that led to this kind of thing, again, the issue is really escalation, and the issue is how Russia is going to perceive the attack and use the attack going forward.
So what's your best assessment of what Russia will do if they make good? Because there's been many officials from Lavrov to Peskov, the Ministry of Defense and Ministry of Foreign Affairs put out specific statements, and the Russian ambassador to the UN also put out a speech that he said there will be consequences. So this seems to be more than just kind of empty rhetoric. What do you think is a round of things they might do?
Well, I think, as we keep salami slicing towards escalation, right? I mean, we keep slowly kind of raising the bar over time. I wouldn't be surprised if Russia conducted a more aggressive missile attacks on infrastructure in Ukraine or in other locations. We've seen them do that in the past. They've done that in response to some of these oil refinery attacks as well. And really the net result of this is always negative for Ukraine, right? I mean, Ukraine ends up expending a lot of air defense munitions to try to defend these sites after a Russian oil refinery gets hit. And it just doesn't really do much for Ukraine as far as achieving anything on the battlefield. And so, again, I think we could see Russia conduct more attacks. They hit Odessa very hard just the other day. I think you could see more attacks on Odessa. That sort of would be a similar tit for tat in my view. And I think in general, this idea that we just keep ignoring, the Russians whenever they are making rhetoric like this, I think is very risky, right? And everybody gets to say that it's fine until all of a sudden it isn't, right? And that's my concern, is that we don't know exactly where Russia's red lines are, but they exist. And I don't think we should really be in the business of playing
trying
around
to find out,
try to find them, right? I mean, that's where, again, I think it is incumbent on the United States as the global hegemon and as the leader of the free world to try to avoid nuclear escalation as a first principle. I mean, right? This is what we did during the Cold War, right? Mm-hmm. Whether it was Gorbachev or Khrushchev, whatever. I mean, we negotiated. We've had frequent discussions with the Soviets. And that's another point that I think needs to be made in all this really quickly, Danny, is, diplomacy is not this gift that we just give to our best good friends and our allies. Diplomacy has to be conducted arguably more frequently and more with more latitude, frankly, with your adversaries. And I think that was a big lesson of the Cold War that a lot of hawks today have totally forgotten, that you do need to have discussions with adversaries, and you do need to have discussions with other great powers and nuclear armed states if we're going to avoid something truly horrific.
Yeah, I could not more strongly agree with you. I'm a big advocate of a much more robust use of diplomacy as a much more cost-effective way to get things to work out the way we want, instead of the path we've been going down. But listen, thank you for coming on and providing such clarity on this today. And again, I'd recommend everybody to read this paper. A lot of good detail in it. It's in the description system. You can click on it there. You can also find it online at Defense Priorities. Mike, thanks so much for coming on today. Really appreciate it.
Thanks, Danny. Take care.
And thank you guys for joining us today as well. Always appreciate you coming on. Be sure and like and subscribe if you haven't already. Share this with your friends. We want to make sure that more people get the truth and the things that are really going on, so you know what's happening on the ground, so you're not caught unawares if things happen to kind of go sideways, especially when folks like Mike Dimino have been predicting them. Be sure and join us tomorrow. We're going to have Larry Johnson back on. We're also going to be back to our normal intel brief to catch you up on all the things you may have missed during the week. That'll be on tomorrow. Not going to want to miss those. And in the meantime, we will see you on the next episode of Daniel Davis Deep Dive.